The crisp, unforgiving air of March 1749 settled over the ancient estate of Le Bignon, tucked quietly within the rolling countryside of northern France. In the grand bedchambers of the manor, a child entered the world marked by strange and forbidding physical traits. Honoré Gabriel Riquetti was born with a frame unnaturally robust, a twisted foot, and a skull so unusually large that the attending midwives whispered in muted tones of foreboding. Yet it was not his birth that truly carved his fate into the dark bedrock of French history, but the tragedy that visited him 3 years later. Smallpox struck the household, laying siege to the infant boy's fragile skin. In an ill-conceived attempt to treat the violently erupting pustules, an agonizing poultice was slathered across his face, searing into his flesh and leaving behind a landscape of deep, cavernous scars, pitted craters, and permanent disfigurement. The golden child of an exalted line was rendered horrifying to behold, a boy whose very face was transformed into a canvas of brutal, jagged, ruined flesh. His father, Victor de Riquetti, Marquis de Mirabeau, looked upon his second son not with paternal tenderness, but with profound revulsion. The Marquis was a renowned figure of the Enlightenment, a celebrated philosopher and economist who authored sprawling treatises on human compassion and agricultural reform, earning himself the grand public title of the Friend of Men. Yet behind the heavy, oak doors of his own estate, the elder Mirabeau was a cold, tyrannical patriarch who viewed Honoré Gabriel as an intolerable blight upon the family honor. Where the Marquis demanded rigid obedience, the young Honoré possessed an unyielding, tempestuous spirit. As the boy grew into adolescence and early adulthood, his intellect proved extraordinarily sharp, his memory monstrously capacious, and his thirst for freedom utterly uncontainable. But the father saw only a grotesque monster whose passions threatened to tarnish the pristine reputation of the House of Riquetti. The rift between father and son quickly escalated from cold domestic warfare into open, ruthless persecution. Honoré Gabriel's youth was marked by wild extravagances, mountainous gambling debts, and a series of tumultuous, scandalous love affairs that scandalized the conservative provincial elite. Rather than allowing his son to face civil courts or settle his own debts, the Marquis chose to wield the ultimate instrument of aristocratic tyranny, the lettre de cachet. These sealed royal warrants, signed directly by the King of France, permitted a noble family to incarcerate an unruly relative indefinitely, without trial, without appeal, and without public record. The Marquis purchased these arbitrary warrants with cold efficiency, repeatedly using the authority of the crown to lock his own son away in the dark corners of the realm. The young count was cast into the bleakest fortresses of 18th-century France. First came the Château d'If, a grim, sun-bleached rock protruding from the churning blue waters of the Mediterranean near Marseille. Surrounded by sheer, slippery cliffs and the relentless crashing of salty waves, Honoré Gabriel was locked away in a damp, isolated cell where the sea wind howled perpetually through narrow stone arrow slits. The dampness seeped into his bones, inflaming his lungs and leaving him tormented by violent chest pains and severe, throbbing blurs in his vision. Yet the stone walls could not crush his spirit. Instead, the isolation transformed his fury into an engine of incredible literary production. In the dark, shivering hours of the night, illuminated only by the faint, flickering flame of a dwindling tallow candle, he dipped a coarse goose quill into black ink and poured his soul onto rough parchment. Transferring later to the icy fastness of the Fort de Joux, perched precariously high upon a razor-thin crag in the freezing Jura Mountains along the Swiss border, his captivity grew even more severe. Cold mountain winds whistled through the timber roof beams, and frost painted intricate, crystalline patterns across his iron cell doors. Here, trapped in the freezing gloom while suffering from recurring bouts of fever and agonizing inflammation of the eyes, Mirabeau composed one of his greatest early political works, his fiery essay on despotism. In this scathing manuscript, written under the very nose of his royal guards, he dismantled the moral legitimacy of absolute monarchy and arbitrary royal power, damning the very royal warrants that kept him chained to the mountain bedrock. Yet alongside these bold, public-facing political manifestos, Mirabeau maintained a deeply confidential secret life within his notebooks. He kept private journals, tucked carefully beneath the straw matting of his meager bed or stitched into the lining of his heavy coat. Within these hidden pages, the young aristocrat laid bare his agonizing internal conflicts. He recorded not merely his political anger, but the profound, overwhelming agony of his physical ailments, the suffocating tightness in his chest, the violent palpitations of his heart, and the terrifying sensation that his body was consuming itself from within. He reflected upon his deeply scarred face, mourning the affection he felt denied by society, while simultaneously expressing a desperate, burning ambition for ultimate redemption. His diary entries revealed a man tormented by the duality of his existence. A disgraced noble rotting in isolation, yet possessing a mind that burned to reshape the entire destiny of France. In these private scribblings, he began to obsess over the legacy he would leave behind, repeatedly contemplating what physical artifact of his tortured body might one day prove to the world that his heart had always beaten for justice, despite the cruelties inflicted upon him by his father and his sovereign. By the time Honoré Gabriel was finally released from his long, grueling years of imprisonment, he emerged into a France that was rapidly crumbling at its very foundations. The late 1780s brought widespread crop failures, devastating winter storms, and a catastrophic financial crisis that pushed the French kingdom to the brink of bankruptcy. Discontent simmered in every village tavern and Parisian salon. King Louis XVI was forced to take a desperate step that had not been taken in over a century and a half. He summoned the Estates General, an ancient assembly representing the three traditional orders of the realm: the first estate of the clergy, the second estate of the nobility, and the third estate of the common populace. Mirabeau returned to his native Provence, intent on claiming a seat in the historic assembly. But when he attempted to stand among his fellow nobles of the second estate, the local aristocracy met him with icy disdain. They viewed him as a ruined degenerate, a disgraced ex-convict whose scandalous past and scarred countenance made him unfit to sit among the privileged elite. His own father's long-standing smear campaign had borne fruit. The noble class closed its doors firmly against him. Rather than accepting defeat, Mirabeau executed a breathtaking political maneuver that shattered centuries of feudal tradition. Rejecting his own noble order, he turned directly to the commoners of the Third Estate. He traveled to the vibrant towns of Aix-en-Provence and Marseille, offering his voice to the lawyers, merchants, artisans, and peasants who composed 98% of the French population, yet held virtually no political power. When Mirabeau stepped onto the public podiums, the crowd was initially stunned by his formidable and intimidating presence. He was a man of massive, imposing build, with a thick mane of dark hair swept back from his grand head, and a face terribly marred by the deep pitmarks of smallpox. But the moment he opened his mouth, his physical defects dissolved beneath the sheer thunder of his voice. His powerful, resonant baritone vibrated through crowded market squares and packed halls. He spoke with an electrifying eloquence, attacking the privileges of the nobility, condemning the arbitrary abuses of the crown, and giving voice to the deep, aching grievances of the starving populace. The very scars that had once marked him as an outcast now transformed into symbols of rugged, unyielding strength, proof that he had suffered under the iron heel of despotism and survived. The Third Estate embraced him not as an arrogant noble benefactor, but as their ultimate champion, electing him by a landslide to represent Aix-en-Provence at the coming Estates General. In May 1789, as the spring blossoms covered the French countryside, Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, rode toward the Grand Palace of Versailles. He arrived not as a quiet courtier seeking royal favor, but as an unstoppable force of nature, stepping off his carriage into the crowded, bustling streets of the royal city as a deputy for the Third Estate of Aix-en-Provence, ready to confront the king, the court, and the ancient regime itself. The grand avenues of Versailles in May 1789 were choked with a sea of silk, feather, and dust as the three orders of the French realm assembled in unprecedented grandeur. The sun beat down upon the glittering procession, casting long shadows across the cobblestones where the nobility and high clergy marched in vibrant robes, drenched in gold thread and ostentatious privilege. Behind them, forced into uniform black woolen coats like mourners at a funeral, walked the deputies of the Third Estate. Among this dark, resentful tide stood Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau. His massive shoulders squared, his heavily pockmarked face lifted against the subtle gasps and whispered insults of his own noble peers who watched from the balconies above. They had shunned him, branded him an outcast and a degenerate, yet here he walked, elevated by the common people of Aix-en-Provence to be their voice in the heart of the monarchy. Inside the sprawling Salle des Menus Plaisirs, the air grew thick with the suffocating scent of candle wax, sweat, and centuries of unyielding royal protocol. As the opening weeks of the Estates General dragged into an agonizing deadlock, the tensions between the privileged orders and the commoners reached a boiling point. The king sought merely to raise taxes. The Third Estate demanded a complete transformation of the state. When King Louis XVI attempted to dissolve the recalcitrant deputies in late June, ordering them to vacate the hall and disperse to their separate chambers, the royal master of ceremonies, dressed in grand velvet and carrying his ceremonial wand of office, stepped forward to enforce the sovereign command. It was in that electric moment of confrontation that Mirabeau's voice erupted like thunder through the cavernous room. Stepping out from the ranks of hesitant men, His towering figure illuminated by the pale light filtering through the high windows, he confronted the royal envoy. His resonant baritone, forged in the echo chambers of his long imprisonment, filled every corner of the hall, declaring that they were there by the will of the people and would only be removed at the point of the bayonet. The defiance sent shockwaves through the royal court and ignited the imagination of a restless nation. Overnight, the disgraced noble with the ruined face became the indisputable lion of the National Assembly, the ultimate champion of liberty, hailed by the crowds of Paris as the invincible defender of the Third Estate. Yet, as summer turned to autumn and 1789 bled into 1790, the political landscape transformed into a terrifying, uncontainable storm. The fall of the Bastille, the bloody heads raised high on iron pikes through the streets of the capital, and the chaotic October March that dragged King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette from Versailles to virtual captivity in the Tuileries Palace horrified Mirabeau to his very core. In the privacy of his study, removed from the roaring applause of the assembly floor, he watched with mounting dread as the fragile threads of order snapped one by one. Mirabeau had never desired the destruction of the monarchy. His vision was not one of republican violence or mob rule, but of a balanced constitutional kingdom, modeled on a grand synthesis of royal authority and popular freedom. He looked upon the rising faction of radical revolutionaries with deep horror, recognizing that the unchecked passions of the street would inevitably lead to violent tyranny and complete societal collapse. He saw himself as the only mind capable of steering the ship of state through the treacherous waters of chaos, saving the nation from both the blind obstinacy of the court and the bloody fury of the populace. Driven by this conviction and burdened by his own perpetually devastating debts, Mirabeau initiated a dangerous, highly secret gamble in May 1790. Through a trusted political intermediary, he established a covert line of communication with the desperate royal family held captive in the Tuileries. Queen Marie Antoinette, who had once openly despised Mirabeau, referring to him in her private letters as a monster, now found herself forced by circumstances to seek his intellect. In the dead of night, behind heavily curtained doors and within the secluded gardens of St. Cloud, secret messages passed between the revolutionary champion and the endangered crown. A secret pact was forged. In exchange for massive financial compensation drawn directly from the royal treasury paying off his staggering mountain of personal debts and granting him a handsome monthly retainer, Mirabeau bound himself as a confidential advisor to King Louis XVI. He began authoring a brilliant series of secret political notes, carefully drafting detailed strategy papers that instructed the king on how to outmaneuver the radical factions, preserve the core executive powers of the crown, win back the love of the French people, and establish a stable constitutional order. This treacherous double existence demanded an agonizing physical and mental toll. By day, Mirabeau ascended the podium of the National Assembly, delivering fiery, revolutionary speeches that thrilled the radical galleries and kept his public authority intact. By night, under the pale glow of flickering tallow candles, he sat hunched over his desk, scratching out secret communications to the king, warning Louis of the very forces Mirabeau himself helped unleash in the public arena. The intense, relentless strain of playing both savior of the people and secret defender of the monarch began to shatter his already fragile constitution. By the late autumn of 1790, his body was in a state of violent revolt. The severe, chronic eye inflammation that had plagued him since childhood flared with horrifying intensity. His eyelids burned like hot irons, swelling so severely that he was frequently forced to spend hours in total darkness, weeping tears tainted with blood while his terrified servants applied ice compresses and leeches to his temples to draw off the pressure. Yet, even as blood trickled down his scarred cheeks, he refused to stop working, dictating his confidential notes to the crown through gritted teeth. Compounding his visual agony were severe, agonizing cardiac afflictions brought on by sheer physical exhaustion and the incessant pressure of his secret life. Sudden, suffocating spasms tore through his chest, making him clutch at his throat as if an invisible weight was crushing his lungs. His heart would race wildly, hammering against his ribs in irregular, terrifying thuds that left him drenched in cold sweat, gasping for air upon his sofa. In these quiet, dark hours between frantic public debates and secret midnight writings, Mirabeau turned to his private journals to pour out the terrifying anguish of his soul. His diary became a sanctuary of tragic confession. In its locked pages, he laid bare the crushing weight of his dual existence. He acknowledged the terrible danger he walked every single day. He knew with absolute certainty that if his financial arrangements with the crown were ever exposed, the very crowds that now threw flowers at his feet would string him up from the nearest lamppost as a traitor to the revolution. Yet his entries revealed something far deeper than mere panic over exposure or financial greed. He wrote passionately of his desperate desire for ultimate redemption, justifying his actions to himself and to history. He insisted in his intimate scribblings that the royal gold he received was not a bribe to sell out his principles, but the necessary means to save France from self-destruction. He saw his tortured heart as the true epicenter of his political sacrifice, recording his profound fear that he would die before the nation ever understood his true intentions. He mused hauntingly upon his failing health, writing of the sharp, stabbing pains in his breast as a physical manifestation of his tragic devotion to a country that was devouring itself. It was during this dark period of physical collapse that Dr. Pierre-Jean-Georges Cabanis became an indispensable presence in Mirabeau's daily life. A brilliant physician, philosopher, and dedicated man of science, Cabanis was not merely an attending doctor but one of Mirabeau's closest, most intimate friends. Cabanis moved through the dimly lit bedchambers of Mirabeau's home, monitoring the alarming deterioration of his patient's pulse, applying warm plasters to his chest, and observing with growing despair the relentless decay of a titan. Cabanis listened intently as Mirabeau, gasping between heavy fits of coughing, spoke in hushed, tortured tones about the crushing burdens weighing upon his chest and the fragile, uncertain future of the nation. By December 1790, as a freezing winter gripped the streets of Paris and frost covered the iron gates of the Tuileries, Mirabeau's physical condition had deteriorated drastically. The titan of the assembly could no longer hide the heavy, labored steps, the gray pallor of his skin, or the agony that gripped his chest whenever he raised his voice to speak. The relentless strain of his double life had brought his body to the absolute brink of total structural failure. Sitting in his private chamber, staring into the flickering embers of his hearth as the snow fell outside, Mirabeau realized with absolute clarity that his time was rapidly running out, compelling him to make urgent, final preparations for his papers, his legacy, and the ultimate fate of his tortured body. As the dark chill of winter yielded to the dawn of 1791, Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, stood at the absolute pinnacle of his political triumph, even as his physical frame tottered on the precipice of total collapse. In late January, by an overwhelming vote of his peers, he was elevated to the presidency of the National Assembly. It was the highest legislative office in revolutionary France, a position that demanded supreme mental clarity, unyielding stamina, and an authoritative voice capable of quelling the tempestuous debates of a nation in turmoil. To the public eye, he was a titan cast in bronze. When he ascended the rostrum, clad in his dark tailcoat with his powdered hair cascading about his broad, scarred shoulders, he commanded the room with an almost hypnotic authority. His baritone voice boomed through the vaulted hall of the writing school near the Tuileries Palace, silencing radical Jacobins and monarchist reactionaries alike with the sheer force of his rhetoric. Yet behind this majestic facade lay a body in terrible, violent rebellion. Each time Mirabeau slammed his presidential gavel onto the hardwood desk, a blinding surge of agony reverberated up his arm and pierced his chest like a red-hot blade. The cardiac spasms that had haunted him in secret now struck with unrelenting frequency. Beneath his fine linen shirt, his heart fluttered uncontrollably, beating out a ragged, erratic rhythm that left him dizzy and gasping for breath between sentences. To conceal his weakness from the sharp, predatory eyes of his political rivals, he would grip the edges of the marble podium until his knuckles turned bone white, forcing his agonizing chest to expand and projecting his voice across the crowded assembly hall through sheer, unadulterated willpower. When the sessions concluded, he did not walk. He was virtually carried by his devoted companions into the privacy of his carriage, where he collapsed onto the velvet cushions, coughing into silk handkerchiefs that repeatedly emerged stained with dark, arterial blood. By March 1791, the fragile dam holding back his physical ruin finally burst. The severe chest pain became an unbearable, continuous fire, radiating down his left arm and paralyzing his breath. Forced to retreat entirely from the public sphere, Mirabeau was confined to his grand bedchamber in his private residence on the Rue de la Chaussée d'Antin. The bustling capital outside his door seemed to hold its breath. News of the great orator's sudden collapse sent shockwaves through the streets of Paris. Dense, anxious crowds gathered beneath his tall, arched windows, standing in solemn silence on the cold cobblestones to await updates from his physicians. The municipal authorities went so far as to scatter thick layers of straw along the street to deaden the iron clatter of carriage wheels and horses' hooves, ensuring that no sudden noise would disturb the dying champion of the Third Estate. Inside the quiet, heavily curtained bedchamber, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of burning beeswax, vinegar compresses, camphor, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Scores of glass vials containing ineffective herbal tinctures and crushed minerals littered the bedside tables. It was here, in the dim glow of flickering candlelight, that Dr. Pierre-Jean-Georges Cabanis kept his constant, tragic vigil. Cabanis was more than an attending physician. He was Mirabeau's intellectual confidant, a man of profound philosophical vision who understood both the intricate mechanics of the human body and the deep, tortured recesses of his friend's mind. Day and night, Cabanis sat by the bed, repeatedly taking Mirabeau's thready, erratic pulse, applying warm mustard plasters to his congested chest, and wiping the cold, clammy sweat from the orator's deeply pitted forehead. It was during these final, agony-filled weeks of March that Mirabeau, acutely aware that his life was slipping away, opened his heart to Cabanis in a series of urgent, secret conversations. He knew his time was measured not in months, but in days. He spoke not with the theatrical bravado of the assembly floor, but with the terrifying candor of a man staring directly into the abyss. He confessed to Cabanis his haunting realization that his political project remained incomplete, and that his death would leave France leaderless, teetering on the edge of a bloody and uncontrollable abyss. But above all, Mirabeau was consumed by a desperate, agonizing anxiety regarding his memory and his legacy. He knew that buried within his private lockboxes and hidden drawers were copies of his secret correspondence with King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. He had spent months playing a dangerous double game, accepting immense sums from the royal treasury while publicly defending the revolution. In the solitude of his bedchamber, Mirabeau voiced his haunting fear to Cabanis. If those secret letters were ever discovered by his political enemies after his death, his name would be dragged through the mud, branded as that of a mercenary traitor who had sold out the people of France. It was against this background of looming dishonor that Mirabeau dictated specific, binding instructions regarding his bodily remains and his private journals. In his diary, he had painstakingly documented his true motives, writing passionately that his secret counsel to the crown was never meant to betray the revolution, but to save it from its own radical excesses to forge a stable, constitutional state where liberty and law could coexist. To ensure that his true intent would outlive any future political scandal, Mirabeau made a singular, extraordinary demand of his trusted friend and physician. He requested that upon his death, Dr. Cabanis perform a formal autopsy and physically extract his heart from his breast. Mirabeau wished for his preserved heart to be set apart as an eternal, physical token of his ultimate devotion to the French nation. In the aristocratic tradition of France, the separate burial of the heart cardiotaphyia was an ancient honor reserved for royalty and high nobility, a symbolic act signifying that while the body belonged to the earth, the heart belonged to an immortal cause. But for Mirabeau, this act possessed a far deeper, almost desperate psychological weight. He saw his tortured, diseased heart as the ultimate witness of his sacrifice. He believed that even if his written political maneuvers were later misunderstood or vilified by factional hatred, the physical preservation of his heart, the very organ that had burned and failed under the immense weight of his love for France, would stand as an incorruptible testament to his purity of purpose. Cabanis, deeply moved by the terrifying eloquence and tragic vulnerability of his dying friend, gave his solemn oath. He promised to execute Mirabeau's final wishes to the exact letter, guarding both his personal papers and his physical remains with his own life. On the morning of April 2, 1791, the final act of the tragedy unfolded. As the first pale rays of spring sunlight filtered through the heavy silk drapes of his bedchamber, Mirabeau awoke from a fitful, pain-racked stupor. He could no longer speak above a low, rasping whisper. He gestured for Cabanis to pull back the curtains, gazing out toward the brightening sky. He whispered famously to those gathered at his bedside that he carried in his heart the funeral shrouds of the French monarchy, predicting that upon his death, the factions would tear the kingdom to pieces. Moments later, a violent spasm shook his chest. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowed to shallow, ragged gasps, and at precisely 8:30 in the morning, Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, drew his final breath at the age of 42. The silence that fell over the bedchamber was deafening, soon echoed by the sound of muffled weeping from his servants and friends. Outside, as the news crossed the threshold of the residence, a collective gasp swept through the waiting crowds on the Rue de la Chaussée d'Antin. Within hours, shops closed across Paris, theatrical performances were cancelled, and the tolling of heavy bronze church bells began to resonate across the city, announcing a state of profound national grief. Inside the quiet house, however, Dr. Cabanis immediately set about fulfilling his sacred promise. Assisted by a small, selected group of medical colleagues, Cabanis conducted the post-mortem examination upon the mahogany table in the adjoining room. The room smelled sharply of carbolic wash, spirit of wine, and bitter herbs. With meticulous, clinical precision, Cabanis wielded his steel scalpels, making the deep anatomical incisions through the chest wall to open the thoracic cavity. As Cabanis exposed the interior of the chest, he observed the extensive damage wrought by months of severe cardiovascular disease, the enlarged, overworked ventricle, the inflamed tissues that had brought the great orator such agony in his final days. Carefully severing the great vessels, Cabanis lifted Mirabeau's heavy, still heart from the cavernous chest. He bathed the organ in preserving spirits and placed it into a polished copper vessel, sealing it securely in accordance with noble custom and the explicit, frantic request of the man who had willed it removed. Standing over the lifeless body of the Titan, holding the preserved vessel in his hands as the solemn bells of Paris echoed through the window glass, Cabanis prepared to guide his friend's legacy into an uncertain and dangerous future. The grief that washed over the French capital in the spring days following Mirabeau's death was unlike anything the nation had ever witnessed. It was not merely the mourning of a popular nobleman, but the collective shudder of a society that felt its anchor had snapped in the middle of a rising storm. On the afternoon of April 4, 1791, a funeral procession of unimaginable scale wound its way through the dense, winding streets of Paris. More than 300,000 people gathered in deep, somber silence, lining the boulevards from the Rue de la Chaussée-d'Antin to the elevated plateau of the Latin Quarter. National Guardsmen walked with arms reversed, their black armbands fluttering in the chill spring breeze, while muffled bass drums resonated against the stone facades like the slow, labored heartbeat of a dying nation. At the head of this monumental procession was the heavy lead coffin containing Mirabeau's earthly remains. Behind it walked the entire National Assembly, accompanied by ministers of state, foreign diplomats, civic officials, and thousands of ordinary citizens from the Third Estate who wept openly for the man they believed had given his life to break their ancient chains. The destinies of France had been transformed to accommodate his death. The Assembly had hastily decreed that the magnificent, newly completed Church of Saint Genevieve, designed by Soufflot with its soaring neoclassical dome and towering Corinthian columns, would be stripped of its religious function and rededicated as a grand secular mausoleum, the Panthéon. Above its grand portico, workers carved an inscription that would define the revolutionary era: "To its great men, a grateful fatherland." Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, was laid to rest as the very first inhabitant of this grand sanctuary of liberty. Under the vaulted shadows of the crypt, his body was interred with all the solemn majesty that a fledgling democracy could bestow upon its brightest star. Public orators praised him as the Hercules of the Revolution, the giant who had single-handedly stood between the tyranny of the monarchy and the sacred rights of the people. Yet, far from the grand public ceremonies and the deafening eulogies, a far quieter, deeply intimate ritual was taking place in the private study of Dr. Pierre-Jean-Georges Cabanis. On his heavy oak desk sat the copper vessel, sealed with lead and wax, containing Mirabeau's extracted heart. In the quiet hours of the night, while the distant echoes of funeral trumpets faded into the cold city air, Cabanis began the agonizing task of going through the personal papers, intimate letters, and confidential leather-bound journals that his late friend had entrusted to his care. It was within these secret pages, written in Mirabeau's hurried, impatient hand, that the true, harrowing motive behind his final, bizarre request began to emerge. The diary was not merely a log of political strategies or public triumphs. It was a confession chamber of a soul perpetually caught in a vice between his revolutionary ideals and his terrifying premonitions of the future. Page after page revealed a man tormented by the knowledge of his own duplicity, suffering under the unbearable weight of a double life that he knew was unsustainable. In entries written during the lonely midnight hours of late 1790, when the chest pains had already begun to gnaw at his physical strength, Mirabeau had written extensively about the impending collapse of France. He foresaw with terrifying clarity that the radical factions in the National Assembly would tear down the remaining pillars of order, leading the country not into enlightenment, but into an abyss of fanatical bloodletting and anarchy. He wrote of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette not as divine rulers, but as tragic, short-sighted figures who had to be saved from their own folly in order to preserve the delicate fabric of the state. The diary entries laid bare the profound psychological agony that had consumed Mirabeau's final year. He knew that his covert correspondence with the royal couple, along with the substantial sums he accepted from the royal treasury to pay off his astronomical debts, would be viewed by the public as the ultimate betrayal if ever brought to light. He wrote of his profound dread that history would reduce his entire life, his suffering in the dungeons of his father, and his fierce defenses of human liberty to the simple, damning label of treason. It was here, in the raw, ink-stained entries of his private journal, that the mystery of his heart extraction found its tragic resolution. Mirabeau had explicitly detailed why he needed his heart severed from his body before the tide of history swept over his grave. He knew that the human mind was susceptible to political calculation, to tactical compromises, and to the dirty mechanics of power. He acknowledged that his actions had been dirty, that his alliances had been compromised, and that his public rhetoric had often masked a desperate, secret game to save the crown from destruction and the people from self-slaughter. But his heart, he insisted in those private pages, belonged entirely to France. By ordering Cabanis to physically cut the heart from his chest, Mirabeau was attempting a final, desperate act of redemption. He wished to separate the calculating, pragmatic politician whose body would remain subject to the shifting judgments of men from the pure, visceral organ that had literally worn itself out in a frantic attempt to save his country. He viewed his heart as an incorruptible witness, an organ that had burned with genuine passion for the freedom of his countrymen, unsoiled by the political maneuvering that had dictated his secret meetings at Versailles and the Tuileries. He had written that while his words might be painted as lies and his tactics as treason, his heart had bled true for the nation, and it deserved to exist apart from his fallible, earthly corpse. Dr. Cabanis read these entries with tears welling in his eyes, holding the heavy copper vessel in his hands. He understood now that Mirabeau's final request was not an act of noble vanity, nor was it a mere continuation of ancient aristocratic custom. It was the desperate plea of a man who foresaw his own disgrace, seeking to preserve a single piece of his legacy before the revolutionary flames consumed his memory. Cabanis swore a silent oath to protect both the journal and the vessel, concealing them from the increasingly paranoid scrutiny of the political factions that were beginning to wrestle for control of Paris. For over a year, Mirabeau's memory remained untarnished in the public consciousness. His marble bust stood prominently in the hall of the National Assembly, and citizens made pilgrimages to the crypt of the Panthéon to lay garlands of laurel upon his stone tomb. But the turbulent current of the French Revolution moved with a swift, merciless violence. By the summer of 1792, the fragile compromise between the monarchy and the people had utterly shattered. On August 10, an armed mob stormed the Tuileries Palace, overthrowing the thousand-year-old French monarchy and throwing King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette into the gloomy towers of the Temple prison. The fall of the palace opened every door to the scrutiny of the triumphant revolutionaries. In November 1792, a locksmith named François Gamain came forward to the newly formed National Convention with a shocking revelation. He disclosed that months before the fall of the throne, he had helped King Louis construct a secret iron safe, the armoire de fer, hidden deep within the stone walls of the royal apartments, behind a concealed wooden panel. On November 20, Roland, the Minister of the Interior, personally opened the iron safe. Inside lay hundreds of private documents, letters, and confidential state papers that the royal family had desperately tried to conceal. Among the bundles of tied parchment were the full, unedited records of Mirabeau's covert relationship with the crown. The news crashed through Paris like a thunderclap. The documents provided undeniable proof that while Mirabeau had stood before the National Assembly delivering fiery speeches against tyranny, he had been receiving a monthly retainer of 20,000 livres directly from the royal treasury. The safe contained over 30 secret memoranda written in Mirabeau's distinctive hand, detailing precise tactical instructions for the king on how to undermine the assembly, manipulate public opinion, bribe key deputies, and prepare for the eventual restoration of royal authority. The public reaction was swift, visceral, and unsparing. The hero of the revolution was instantly rebranded as the ultimate Judas. In the hall of the National Convention, deputies shouted curses at his memory. Outside, mobs swarmed the streets, smashing plaster busts of Mirabeau and dragging his likeness through the gutter. The man who had been hailed as the father of French liberty was now denounced as a corrupt, self-serving charlatan who had sold the blood of the people for royal gold. In September 1793, as the reign of terror descended upon France under the dark auspices of the Committee of Public Safety, the National Convention formally decreed that Mirabeau was unworthy of resting in the sacred soil of the Panthéon. His name was erased from the public monuments, and plans were made to remove his body from the secular temple he had inaugurated. On a bleak, rain-soaked night in November 1794, 2 guards and a small team of gravediggers descended into the cold, silent crypts of the Panthéon. Without ceremony, without torches, and without a single word of eulogy, they pried open the heavy stone vault. They dragged Mirabeau's lead coffin into the damp night air, loading it onto a rough wooden cart. The cart rattled through the darkened, silent streets of Paris to the obscure cemetery of Clamart, a burial ground used primarily for executed criminals and unclaimed corpses from the city hospitals. There, in the wet, muddy earth, the coffin of Honoré Gabriel Riquetti was lowered into an unmarked mass grave. Lime was poured over the lead container, and the earth was shoveled back, completely effacing the final resting place of the man who had once commanded the destiny of millions. In an ironic twist of revolutionary history, his vacated spot in the Pantheon was immediately given to Jean-Paul Marat, the radical journalist whose bloody calls for execution stood as the absolute antithesis of Mirabeau's constitutional vision. Yet, despite the total destruction of his public grave and the systematic vilification of his name, the true essence of Mirabeau's final request remains safely guarded in the shadows. Dr. Pierre-Jean-Georges Cabanis, surviving the dangerous purges of the Terror through his discretion and medical indispensability, kept the preserved heart and the personal papers hidden away from the prying eyes of the revolutionary tribunals. Cabanis knew that the mob saw only the black and white blackness of betrayal, lacking the depth to understand the tragic complexity of a man who had tried to navigate the impossible middle ground of a collapsing civilization. In the final analysis, the legacy of Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, refuses to be neatly categorized by the harsh judgments of his contemporaries or the simplistic narratives of history. He was a man of colossal contradictions, a corrupt aristocrat who fought for the rights of the poor, an imprisoned rebel who sought to strengthen the crown, a master orator whose public words shook the world, and a secret strategist whose private writings revealed a desperate, aching heart. When historians eventually re-examined his private papers and diary entries in the decades following the revolution, the true narrative of his life emerged not as a simple story of greed or treason, but as a profound classical tragedy. His diary proved that he had never sought the destruction of the revolution, nor the return of absolute despotism. He had sought, with a frantic and exhausting passion, to synthesize liberty and order, to prevent the total destruction of his country by playing a game of dangerous, high-stakes political chess. The reason he had ordered his heart removed before his death was finally understood in its full, devastating depth. He had known that the world would eventually condemn his mind, his tactics, and his compromised honor. He had known that his body would be cast out, his memory disgraced, and his tomb destroyed. But he had willed his heart to be excised, preserved, and set apart, leaving behind a silent, physical proof that long after the political speeches had faded and the secret iron safes had been breached, there remained an indelible organ that had beaten solely for the love of France. In the quiet, dark corners of history, where the noise of the mob cannot reach, the heart of Mirabeau stands as an immortal witness to the complex, tortured reality of human conviction.